Welcome to Part 7 of Herbert Has Been Murdered. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 31. Hollander's apartment. The rain had started to fall lightly, casting a sheen over the pavement, and he welcomed the distraction from the bustle of the city. As they crossed into the quieter streets of the Upper East Side, his mind drifted back to his last encounter with Mrs. Hollander. It had been 5 years since the tumultuous events surrounding her first husband's untimely death. She was a woman of strength, even if she still bore the scars of that tragedy. He hoped this meeting wouldn't bring more trouble. The last thing she needed was a new reason to worry. The car pulled to a stop in front of the elegant apartment building, and Inspector Williams stepped out, adjusting his coat against the cool breeze. He nodded to the driver, then made his way up the steps and into the spacious lobby, where a doorman greeted him with a respectful tip of the hat. He announced himself to the receptionist and was promptly directed to Mrs. Hollander's apartment on the top floor. Each step felt heavy with anticipation. He was unsure what would await him behind her door, but he sensed it was no trivial matter. As he knocked, he heard the sound of quick footsteps inside before the door swung open. Mrs. Hollander stood there, her expression a mix of relief and anxiety. "Inspector Williams, thank you for coming," she said urgently, ushering him in and closing the door behind him. "Mrs. Hollander, it's my pleasure. What seems to be the problem?" he asked, noting the tension in her posture as she led him to the sitting room. "Please sit. I'm glad you're here. It's about my husband, Thomas," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying her worry. "I'm afraid he might be in danger." Detective Williams leaned forward, attentive. "What makes you think that?" "He's been acting strangely. There are things he hasn't been telling me, and the other night I overheard a conversation that left me unsettled," she explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Tell me everything," he encouraged, sensing the urgency in her words. As she spoke, Inspector Williams made notes in his mind. This was no ordinary concern. There was an undercurrent of fear in her voice, and he understood the weight of her anxieties all too well. Hollander's thoughts drifted as he stood on Park Avenue. Memories flooded his mind, of Nancy Norwich and Herbert Franklin, both long gone, of Madame Suarez, who had also passed away. He pictured Mrs. Quammen, now back in her beloved New England hills, sinking her essence into the rugged granite, drawing life from it like a flower blooming in a tiny crack of solid rock. He remembered Smithers, whom he had never seen again after the Sullivan law had been used against her, leaving her fate uncertain. She had likely returned to England, where she would be lost in her own troubled thoughts, far from the chaos that had surrounded her. Then there was Hollander's partner, the Southern Mr. Smith, who had vanished without a trace, quietly fading from memory as if he had never mattered. He had always been a minor player, unworthy of further concern. But mostly, Hollander's mind was consumed with thoughts of Mrs. Franklin, now Mrs. Hollander. History and crime alike were filled with women like her, astounding, beautiful women caught in their own uncertainties, orbiting the normalcy of others, leaving a trail of sorrow and turmoil in their wake. The law could never touch her, nor could any man. She would always slip away, like mercury gliding through helpless fingers. It was clear to him she had escaped, and there was no doubt about it. 5 years ago, she had been the center of the Franklin case, regardless of what the law or anyone else believed. Her forgery of that postscript was not just a petty act aimed at disrupting her husband's affair with Nancy Norwich. It was a calculated move to dismantle all his connections, to undermine him completely. She was, without question, the true killer of her husband, not Nancy Norwich. She had simply laid out the powder train, making it ready for a deadly explosion before striking the match. The movements of the others had resembled nothing more than those of marionettes, strings pulled taut in her control. Some of her marionettes had perished, taken their own lives, or been slain. Yet none of it mattered to her. The world was timeless, she felt timeless, and new puppets emerged every spring. As Inspector Williams stepped down to the curb and readied himself to enter the lift to her apartment, he wondered if Thomas had become one of those puppets, too. The end. The end. This concludes Herbert Has Been Murdered, by Merrick Sharp, narrated by Chris Michelson. Published by BrooksAudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released.